Hello everybody, this is Dr. Beter speaking. Today is August 21, 1975, and this is my monthly audio letter number 3. Today I want to discuss 3 major topics. The first 2 is in response to some things people have asked me about, and the third topic has to do with some major shifts which are now in the works in the plans of the Rockefeller brothers. These topics are: 1. The truth about the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. 2. Some little-known examples of economic power held by the Rockefellers and how they hold that power. 3. How the Rockefeller plans for World War III are being altered by Indira Gandhi's crackdown on the CIA in India. Before I launch into these 3 topics, however, I want to respond to numerous inquiries I have received in a different vein. There are a number of specialized newsletters which deal with various aspects of political economics, and I am often asked if I can recommend any of them. I believe I have a responsibility to direct you toward reliable information sources, which in general do not include the Rockefeller-dominated major news media. One dealing with general news is the Daily News Digest published by Research Publications, Post Office Box 27496, Phoenix, Arizona 85061. The other, which focuses primarily on financial affairs, is International Moneyline. Moneyline is one word: 16 East Trail, Trail, Darien, Connecticut 06820. These complement rather than duplicate one another, and I suggest that you write to them both and decide for yourself. And now topic number 1. On November 22, 1963, the nation and the world were shocked and stunned by a horrible news bulletin from Dallas, Texas. If you heard that bulletin, you probably remember exactly what you were doing when you first heard the impossible news. President John F. Kennedy, riding in a motorcade past thousands of friendly onlookers, had been shot. All too soon our worst fears were realized, as we were told that our President had been assassinated. In remarkably short order, attention focused on a single suspect named Lee Harvey Oswald, who was promptly rounded up and jailed. Oswald's background was thoroughly documented in government files and was the type that would normally have subjected him to intense surveillance by the Secret Service during the President's visit to Dallas. And yet the fact that Oswald was an employee of the Texas School Book Depository right on the parade route seemingly escaped attention ahead of time. But immediately after the shooting, he was immediately traced, cornered, and arrested. He was very nearly killed in a shootout in a movie theater, but instead shot and killed a police officer there and wound up being taken alive. Oswald's survival, however, was quickly remedied, and on nationwide television no less. Arrangements were made for Oswald to be transferred from the Dallas jail to another location, and TV crews were on hand to cover it. As he was en route from his jail cell to a waiting police car, a man named Jack Ruby, well known to the Dallas police and instantly recognized by them, was permitted to make his way to Oswald's side while still inside the police station. Millions of people watched in utter disbelief as Ruby proceeded to shoot and kill Oswald before their very eyes. Oswald had been protesting over and over that he had been made a patsy, but now he would never get to explain what he meant. Then Ruby himself was the next to go. Tough, rugged, healthy Jack Ruby strangely became ill and soon died while in jail. But Dorothy Kilgallen, the syndicated columnist who was also famous as a panelist on the TV show What's My Line, announced that she was about to blow the case wide open. She said that she had talked with Ruby and was about to publish explosive material he had given her in her next column. By odd coincidence, she never wrote the column, or at least it was never published. Instead, she allegedly died from a mixed dosage of drugs and alcohol, even though she reportedly had no history of using either to any significant extent. Thus began a nightmare of confusion, doubt, frustration, and fear for the American people. Key people with information bearing on President Kennedy's murder died or vanished left and right in the months that followed, defying all laws of chance. The government's official investigation of the assassination was carried out, of course, by the Warren Commission, appointed by our new President Lyndon Johnson. The Commission was chaired by the then Chief Justice Earl Warren, but was actually guided to a considerable extent by a senior member of the Commission, then Congressman Gerald Ford. Ford's political star rose continuously from then on, and of course he is now our first appointed President. The basic proposal for the 25th Amendment to the United States Constitution, under which both Ford and Nelson Rockefeller acquired their present offices by appointment, was introduced in the Senate only 3 weeks to the day after President Kennedy was killed, almost as if it was ready and waiting. This proposal was introduced on December 13, 1963 by Senator Birch Bayh, who had been put into office by none other than Nelson Rockefeller. After the Warren Commission completed its work, Ford wrote a book strongly defending it. There is now a growing hue and cry to reopen the case, but if you think President Ford will ever do it, at least voluntarily, you had better think again. All of this is no doubt familiar to you, thanks to the efforts of numerous others who have uncovered and publicized various matters relating to the assassination. But, my friends, firm and clear answers still have not been given you by anyone, to my knowledge, on two absolutely central questions. Why was John Kennedy killed, and how? Over the years we've been inundated with facts, allegations, and theories through articles, books, radio and television programs, and what have you. Yet these most central questions remain unanswered. I think this is why I am being bombarded with questions about the JFK assassination, and I think the time has come for me to tell you what I can about it. First, the question of why President Kennedy was killed. During the summer and early fall of 1962, Senator Kenneth Keating of New York embarked on a campaign to alert Americans to the presence of nuclear warhead missiles in Cuba, aimed at the defenseless underbelly of the United States. For months he was ignored, scoffed at, and ridiculed by appointed officials in the government. He might just as well have said, quote, "The gold is gone from Fort Knox," unquote. Obviously such a thing was too mind-boggling to be true. But after a while President Kennedy became concerned personally that there might really be something to Senator Keating's charges. He decided that in any case they should at least be seriously investigated so that the country's fears could be put to rest if they proved untrue. Such a course of action is nothing more than common sense, and once the President took a personal interest in the matter, it was quickly discovered that Senator Keating's patently ridiculous charges were true. We all know that within a matter of days, with the United States on a worldwide military alert, President Kennedy went on nationwide television to tell Americans about the missiles and to demand that Russia remove them immediately. The Cuban Missile Crisis was upon us. A lot of Monday morning quarterbacking has been done in the years since. Many things have been debated, such as whether or not he was wise in not demanding on-site inspections of Cuba afterwards to guarantee that all the missiles were really gone. But regardless of any of these arguments, John Kennedy's courage in doing what he did was even greater than most Americans realize, for he was not only confronting the Soviet Union in a deadly showdown, but he was also double-crossing the Rockefeller interests, who had enabled him to become President in the first instance. By exposing the Cuban Missile buildup and stopping it just short of fully operational status, John Kennedy threw a massive monkey wrench into an attempt to speed up the schedule of nuclear blackmail, which is part of the Rockefeller Plan for complete control of America, in cooperation with their ancestral home, Mother Russia. Thanks to Kennedy's action, an entirely new missile base in the Caribbean would now have to be found and developed to replace Cuba. As I say these words, this job has been accomplished. The Republic of Guyana, Guyana, a neighbor of Venezuela, has been turned into a complete police state by Forbes Burnham, who was put in office for that purpose by David Rockefeller. The Temera airfield in Guyana, 25 miles outside of Georgetown, bigger than JFK Airport in New York, was prematurely turned back to Guyana in 1965 by President Johnson in obedience to Rockefeller orders, and it is now ringed by offensive nuclear missiles targeted on the Panama Canal and on cities in the United States. I have been warning about this situation for more than a year, but to no avail. The removal of the Cuban missiles also meant that Russian military superiority over the United States would have to be achieved by a slower and harder way over a period of years. American military research and development would have to be stalled while Russia went all out to catch up and surpass us. The Vietnamese conflict, into which we were already being dragged for other purposes, could prove the ideal tool for this, causing us to waste our military resources by grinding up massive quantities in war without focusing much on improving military technology. But here too Jack Kennedy was getting in the way. Before he was killed, he had already initiated a sequence of events which were to reverse an increasing Vietnamese involvement and extract us from the Indochina combat scene relatively quickly. All of this meant that Jack Kennedy would have to go. He had launched his new frontier with an idealistic view of an ambitious governmental program which had been put together for him by Rockefeller agents for purposes quite different from those he himself envisioned. But he was beginning to see the light about what was really going on, even stating in a broadcast that, quote, Castro was a tool of an international conspiracy, unquote. Had he been given the chance, he might in time have added up too many things correctly. For his great act of brave patriotism in the Cuban Missile Crisis, President John F. Kennedy thus became a marked man. Agents of the CIA, which has been strictly a tool of the Rockefellers ever since it was started in 1947, arranged a series of possible assassination setups in 1963. As it happened, the one which was actually carried out was the one in Dallas. This brings us to how the assassination was actually carried out. Unfortunately, I know of no delicate way to discuss this aspect of the case, which is critically important. But contrary to the Rockefeller agents who dominate the United States government today, I remain convinced that the American people are not children. that we all want the truth, can handle it if it is given to us straight, and can sense when it is not being given to us. As you know, the Warren Commission concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone in killing President Kennedy. But this conclusion, which has been elaborately and vigorously defended by Gerald Ford, Walter Cronkite, and many other camp followers of the Rockefellers, rests on a premise that is a complete insult to the intelligence of every American. This premise is the so-called single bullet theory. According to this theory, my friends, which was the official judgment of the Warren Commission, a single bullet fired from a barely operable 20-year-old rifle by a poor, repeat poor marksman named Oswald passed through President Kennedy, changed course, went through a car seat, struck Governor John Connally, smashed a rib or two, then smashed his wrist, then injured his leg, leaving behind fragments which Connally still carries in his body today, and then ended up in perfect laboratory specimen condition, completely undamaged except for the ballistic marks used to trace Oswald's gun. This single bullet theory is such nonsense that we would probably throw a mystery novel in the trash in disgust if it contained an episode so silly and amateurish. But this fairy tale was the only way that the Warren Commission could end up with their predetermined conclusion that Oswald acted alone, and that we should therefore put the idea of a conspiracy out of our minds. Of course, Oswald was not around to tell his side of the story, but never mind. A note was conveniently found which we were assured Oswald had written, explaining that he planned to kill President Kennedy. Well, my friends, that single bullet did not kill President Kennedy, nor did any other sniper's bullet. In fact, technical analysis of the famous Zapruder and Associated films, done secretly for me, reveals the President was murdered by means that were far more reliable than even the best sharpshooters. Before I tell you what did happen, based on my own information, let me review several facts which, to my knowledge, have until now never been explained satisfactorily. These facts are gruesome, but they have to be observed and analyzed objectively if the truth is to be known. Fact: before the fatal shot, President Kennedy had already been hit from behind by a shot which had caused him to lean slightly forward and face downward. Fact: he was then killed by a shot that literally blew the upper rear portion of his head off. Several square inches of skull was blown away. Fact: this fatal shot snapped his head and body violently backward and somewhat upward in his seat. Fact: debris from President Kennedy's head exploded to the rear, landing all over the left rear deck of the open-top limousine. Kennedy was sitting in the right rear seat. Fact: at the instant of the fatal shot, the Zapruder film shows what appears to be a rush of something, a blast of some sort, into Kennedy's face from downward and in front of him, from a position within the car. This has never been commented upon, to my knowledge, by TV commentators when the Zapruder film has been telecast. But watch for this blast from within the car. It's there. Fact: the presidential limousine in which the assassination occurred was dismantled and destroyed within 48 hours. This was a grossly illegal destruction of material evidence. Fact: pathologists and researchers who have recently been admitted to the National Archives report that the remains of President Kennedy's brain, another crucial piece of evidence, is strangely missing, misplaced, gone. Here now is my conclusion. Based on these facts plus technical opinions which have been provided to me confidentially, I challenge the United States Government to prove me wrong. The conspirators left nothing to chance or the vagaries of marksmanship. President Kennedy was killed by a device mounted inside the limousine and fired at him from point-blank range. The murder weapon was, of course, hidden, mounted inside the seat upholstery in front of the President. Based on the appearance of the blast in the Zapruder film, it's possible that the murder weapon was essentially an extremely sawed-off shotgun hidden in the seat upholstery ahead of him. But it appears much more likely that the blast was produced by what is known as a shaped charge in a special mounting. A shaped charge is a specially configured explosive device which essentially produces a focused explosion, that is, an explosion that mostly aims in one direction instead of going in all directions like a stick of dynamite. A shaped charge is what enables a bazooka to blast a Sherman tank out of action, and shaped charges come in many sizes, including some small enough to have been hidden easily in the Kennedy limousine. An advantage of the shaped charge from the conspirators' viewpoint is that contrary to a gun or shotgun, it would not produce a bullet or buckshot which might be found by someone in the vicinity and cause undesirable questions to be asked. The only problem with the shaped charge would be its noise. Such a bang would tend to attract the attention of others in the car. However, the conspirators knew that Jackie Kennedy would be too distraught and preoccupied with Jack himself after the blast to have such details register, and the driver of the car would also be preoccupied with the urgent business of trying to maneuver out of the ambush. But that still left Governor John Connally riding in the front seat ahead of the President. The sound of the shaped charge could be expected to attract his attention, even if it was muffled and partially lost in the confusion of gunshots from snipers. The possibility existed that Connally alone might be able to detect that some sort of device had been fired just behind him inside the car. Therefore, John Connally was a specific target in the ambush along with Kennedy. He was not, as has often been supposed, merely the victim of a stray bullet, much less the victim of a bullet that had first struck Kennedy as alleged by the Warren Commission. Connally was potentially the single most dangerous witness to the assassination, so it was imperative that he be incapacitated or killed outright. It did not really matter whether Connally was killed or just seriously injured, so long as his ability to observe events clearly was ruined. This they of course accomplished. Thus multiple sharpshooters were firing at the motorcade for several purposes as it passed through Dealey Plaza. First, they were to create an ambush environment, a distraction, so that the murder blast from within the car would not be recognized for what it was. Second, they were to shoot Governor Connally. Merely as a third priority, they were also to hit the President with a shot or two, just as insurance against any possible malfunction of the murder device mounted in the car. Vice President Lyndon Johnson was not a target at all. Once it is recognized that the murder blast came from within the car, from a position firing slightly upward into Kennedy's face, all of the contorted and forced explanations you have heard up to now about a lot of things cease to be necessary. The bazooka-like blast very naturally threw him violently backward, inflicted the incredibly massive head wounds that killed him, and threw debris all over the rear deck of the car. Furthermore, it is now all too clear why the conspirators would have wanted such an elaborately rigged car destroyed quickly afterwards, something which could scarcely have been done, by the way, without orders or at least approval from the new President Lyndon Johnson. It is also obvious why Kennedy's preserved brain has been spirited away from the National Archives. One look at the wounds inflicted by the murder weapon in the car would cause all of the conclusions of the Warren Commission to be thrown in the garbage bin exactly where they belong. With their new puppet Lyndon Johnson in the White House, the Rockefeller plans were once again safe. Indeed, the Rockefellers squeezed every bit of mileage they could out of JFK's death. As already mentioned, the basic outline of the 25th Amendment, cooked up by Nelson Rockefeller years before, was proposed to Congress only 3 weeks after Kennedy died. Also, seizing on the complete lie that he had been killed by a lonely loony with a cheap gun, a powerful campaign was launched to disarm the American people under the euphemistic banner of gun control. LBJ was used to ramrod massive chunks of the disastrous Rockefeller governmental program through Congress, all the time saying, "Let's do it for Jack." And the Vietnam War spigot, which Kennedy was preparing to turn off, was now opened wide by Johnson. The Rockefeller interests were thus served admirably. American technological creativeness was siphoned off to the benefit of Russia. Deep involvement in Indochina helped the Rockefellers to eventually attain control they desired over vast, high-quality oil reserves in that region which rival those of the Middle East and South China Sea. And the Rockefellers, who are the biggest munition makers in the world, the merchants of death, reap tremendous profits at the expense of taxpayers' money and GIs' lives and injuries. But some important questions still remain to be answered concerning the murder of President Kennedy. 1. Was the device which was the proximate cause of President Kennedy's death triggered by someone in the limousine, or on the limousine, or outside it? 2. Who prepared this device for the execution of President Kennedy? 3. Who had control over the limousine immediately prior to its use in Dallas? To generalize is to omit. It is in the details of things where the truth lies. There is no doubt in my mind that a number of persons were involved in the conspiracy to kill President Kennedy. No doubt at all. It took a group of experts to install the death device, it took another group to cause distraction, and it took only one person to trigger the death device, the shaped charge, outside the limousine by remote control through a radio signal. President Nixon once said that only 3 persons in the United States understood power. One was himself, another was Nelson Rockefeller, the other was John Conley, who was almost eliminated in the Kennedy ambush. We all know that power corrupts and that thieves eventually fall out among themselves. Nixon has been eliminated, and now only Rockefeller and Conley remain. Which will win the power play to rule us all? Are we reduced to these 2 power blocks? Are there no other alternatives? Who will remain to use the CIA as his own personal tool? Why not abolish this CIA, this private super-Gestapo agency now controlled by the Rockefeller brothers themselves? Why not have a congressional investigation and a grand jury investigation by opening the Kennedy assassination to answer these and other questions? I leave it to you, dear listeners. To be aware is to care, and to care is to act. I turn now to topic number 2. A generation ago, the so-called third generation of the Rockefellers began rapidly taking over the reins of one of the world's biggest economic empires from their father, John D. Rockefeller, Jr. Of the 6 members of the third generation, 5 brothers and a sister, 2 proved to be relatively easygoing and content by Rockefeller standards, with their immense inherited wealth. These two were the sister Abby and the late Winthrop Rockefeller, who served as governor of Arkansas for a time. But the other four brothers were incredibly ambitious, more so than even their grandfather John D. Sr., and more ruthless as well. They considered the immense empire they had inherited to be merely a convenient springboard from which to launch really big things. Their father, John D. Jr., had been in the forefront of those who sought to dismantle the Christian faith and remake it into a humanistic, man-made philosophy. And in this connection he had brought up his children to believe that they were uniquely endowed and chosen to rule the world. In the case of the four brothers, John D. III, Nelson, Lawrence, and David, this training took, and for several decades these four brothers have worked tirelessly as a unit in a relentless conquest for control of America and domination of the world for their own mother Russia. In this connection, they were simply carrying forward some of the things that their father and grandfather had already started. But they did so with greater diligence and vastly greater resources than their forebears had had at their disposal. The four brothers long ago divided up the world into spheres of influence for each to concentrate on. John D. III carved out Asia and Africa for his special attentions, and also emerged in the forefront of many so-called philanthropic activities, although the philanthropic image or halo is one cultivated by all of the Rockefellers. As I mentioned in my monthly AUDIO LETTER No. 1 for June 1975, John was personally involved in the spy nest plotting at Lee, Massachusetts, which laid the groundwork for the Pearl Harbor attack, which dragged an unwilling America into World War II. His participation in this plotting was done under the cloak of a supposedly philanthropic international activity called the Institute of Public Relations, or IPR. After the war, the IPR was abolished after congressional investigations exposed its infamous role against America. It's interesting that John is taking a more visible stance than usual these days, hitting the propaganda drive that is intended to pave the way for the secret new Constitution I've described in my latest audio book on that subject. For example, the Rockefeller-controlled Hertz Rent-A-Car Company has just launched a new magazine for customers called No. 1, and the inaugural issue contains a cover article titled, quote, "John D. Rockefeller III, Some Strong Ideas Americans Can Use in the Second Revolution," unquote. In that article, John's involvement in the IPR is paraded as if it were something to be proud of, but it doesn't mention that after Japan was defeated in the war that the IPR helped bring about, John D. Rockefeller III swooped down with his entourage and proceeded to take over the Japanese economy lock, stock, and barrel, consolidating great chunks of it into a huge cartel called the Zaibatsu. The so-called economic miracle of Japan is in fact no more surprising than the remarkably American appearance of this Asian giant since the war. Since World War II, both America and Japan have been under Rockefeller control. After all, even Sony, S-O-N-Y, stands for nothing more than the former Standard Oil Company of New York. Turning now to Nelson, I have said much elsewhere, particularly in monthly AUDIO LETTER No. 1, and suffice it to say that he carved out the United States and Latin America for his special focus and has played the role of inside man in our government ever since the days when he was the so-called closest advisor of Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was a complete puppet of the Rockefellers. To enhance his Latin American image, Nelson has for many years pretended great enthusiasm over Latin American art of all kinds. But in Latin America itself, his rapacious economic activities in the past helped create the image which has been termed the ugly American, and he was long ago labeled public enemy number 1 by certain Latin American newspapers. Then there is Lawrence Rockefeller, who received some unfavorable publicity during the confirmation hearings for Nelson's vice presidency. It was Lawrence, of course, who financed the celebrated anti-Goldberg book to help Brother Nelson in his gubernatorial re-election campaign in 1970. Judging from the testimony, shelling out $60,000 for this purpose apparently took about as much deliberation as buying a box of paper clips would for you or me. Moral scruples don't appear to have been a problem, but appearances were, since the $60,000 was carefully laundered through a roundabout legal route so that the source of the book's financing would not be readily apparent. Lest anyone should consider such shenanigans suspicious, though the testimony contains a beautiful example of the kind of logic the Rockefeller brothers use regularly to befuddle their critics. It was stated that this circuitous routing and disguising of funds for the book wasn't laundering at all, but merely a very common practice in Rockefeller dealings. In other words, they hide what they do all the time, so therefore it must be okay. Here, my friends, is just one hint of the fact that Rockefeller control is extremely pervasive throughout our society, but it is hidden from our view more often than not. At any rate, Lawrence's domain includes the airlines, aerospace, and arms industries of the Rockefellers, who are the world's biggest and most aggressive merchants of death. It also includes the stock market and its manipulation. As you see the stock market crash I have been warning about developing before our eyes, you can send your thank you notes to Lawrence Rockefeller. Finally, we come to David Rockefeller, the youngest of the 4 brothers and the most powerful of them all. David is chairman of the Mammoth Chase Manhattan Bank, one of the 2 or 3 largest bank networks in the world, with over 2,000 branches in some 98 countries throughout the entire world. Chase Manhattan is a prime source of loan funds to the largest companies in America and abroad, and its trust department owns huge amounts of stock in companies that constitute the backbone of the American economy. By granting or denying loans, by hiring ex-CIA agents, by applying pressure on companies that are in debt to Chase Manhattan, including pressure to change the makeup of boards and directors of corporations, banks, insurance companies, etc., by selectively buying and selling stocks, and by other means, David Rockefeller is in a position to pull some very powerful strings just through Chase Manhattan alone. But even Chase Manhattan Bank is the only tiny visible tip of David Rockefeller's iceberg. David Rockefeller is no ordinary banker. He's the key custodian of the incredible worldwide Rockefeller financial empire, and through it he is the most powerful international banker in the world. The Rockefellers control not only Chase Manhattan Bank, but many of the other key money houses both in America and abroad. They control the First National City Bank of New York, the largest in New York City, plus a number of the other major New York banks. They also control many banks where their cartel is not widely recognized, such as the Bank of America, which is the largest bank in the United States, and also the multinational banks abroad, including many investment banking houses here and abroad. The fact that the Rockefellers have succeeded in taking over the huge Morgan interests, which used to be the biggest competitors of the Rockefellers in America, comes as a distinct shock to many people. After all, Morgan Guaranty Trust reportedly maintains a stock portfolio worth $23.5 billion at the present time, the biggest in America. Well, my friends, no less than 16 of the 24 directors of Morgan Guaranty Trust are now Rockefeller agents, and since some have found it unbelievable that Morgan Guaranty is now Rockefeller-dominated, I am now going to name these 16 directors and Rockefeller-controlled organizations in which they are kingpins. They are J. Paul Austin of Coca-Cola, R. Manning Brown, Jr. of the New York Life, Frank T. Carey of IBM, one of the 5 multinationals which the Rockefellers used in 1971 to 72 to launch stagflation through monetary manipulations in Europe, W. Graham Clayton, Jr. of the Southern Railway, Emilio G. Collado of Exxon, the largest corporation in the world and the apple of the Rockefellers' eye, Charles D. Dickey, Jr. of Scott Paper, John T. Dorrance, Jr. of Campbell Soup, Louis W. Foyle of Bethlehem Steel, Thomas S. Gates, formerly of the Defense Department, Howard W. Johnson of MIT, Donald P. Kirscher of the Singer Company, Donald E. Prochnow of Western Electric, Warren M. Shapley of Ralston Purina, George P. Schultz, one of the Fort Knox gold conspirators, who has been paid off with the presidency of the Rockefellers Bechtel Corporation and as a consultant to many of David Rockefeller's corporations, Olcott D. Smith of Aetna Life and Casualty, and Henry S. Wingate of the International Nickel Company of Canada. Their financial empire also includes many of the largest life insurance companies. It also includes control of the privately owned central bank system that causes our money to be printed, the Federal Reserve System. Through control, direct and indirect, of both the Federal Reserve and the top officials of the United States Treasury, David Rockefeller was able to remove America's gold, as I have discussed elsewhere. For details on that, I refer you to my audio book on the Fort Knox gold scandal and to the update in my monthly audio letter number 2 for July 1975. David Rockefeller himself is a director of the New York Federal Reserve Bank Board of Directors. Paul Volcker is now president of the New York Federal Reserve Bank, and he was a former Assistant Secretary for International Monetary Affairs, and he helped David to take the gold from Fort Knox with the other people involved. The Fort Knox gold scandal cover-up conspiracy keeps right on spreading as they try to cover their tracks. The chairman of the Senate and House Banking Committees, Senator Proxmire and Congressman Henry Royce, respectively, are trying to keep the lid on the Fort Knox gold controversy long enough to let the Treasury devise some sort of publicity gimmick to trick the public once again, as they did with the so-called gold inspection visit in September 1974. And to this end, I've just been informed that an attempt is now being made to put some borrowed gold bars into the Central Core Vault at Fort Knox, whose existence I revealed for the first time last month, and which has been empty up to this point. But it's going to be very, very difficult to return over 753,000 bars of gold to that Central Core Vault. All of these things and much more, my friends, lie within David Rockefeller's bailiwick. It was David Rockefeller who single-handedly turned our Middle East policy around in February 1974 in order to prevent his Middle East oil empire from being wrenched out of Rockefeller control in connection with the Arab oil embargo. King Faisal of Saudi Arabia was, as you will recall, a key to the success of that unified Arab action. And in doing what he did, he was placing what he judged to be the Arabs' best interests above those of the Rockefellers. For 30 years, since acquiring the Saudi oil fields by means of World War II and developing them initially with free GI labor at taxpayers' expense, the Rockefellers had had their own way. The net price of Arab oil to the Rockefellers during that 30 years, thanks to chargebacks and various devices, was only 5 cents a barrel. Imagine, crude oil at 5 cents a barrel for over 30 years. What immense profits inured to the Rockefellers. But King Faisal had now decided to put his own people's interests first, just as John Kennedy had done for America in 1963. Both actions amounted to a double-crossing of the Rockefellers, and both resulted in assassination little more than a year afterward. It's not possible to discuss the dimensions of Rockefeller control more than superficially in so short a time, but perhaps you can begin to grasp some idea how it works. They own controlling interests in over 300 multinational banks and corporations, hiding the bulk of this ownership through the use of many thousands of nominees and so-called street names. Through their control of banks and foundations, they're able to create well-disguised director interlocks through which they are able to run their entire giant economic empire as one huge cartel. The monopolistic practices of John D. Rockefeller Sr. pale by comparison with the runaway international monster that has been put together by the four Rockefeller brothers. And this economic empire, built around multinational corporations which yield allegiance to no country but to the Rockefellers instead, is increasingly a political empire as well. As time goes on, their control over what remains outside their grasp is spreading even more rapidly. On July 30, 1975, the Rockefeller interests took a decisive step toward consolidation of their control over still another major power base in America, the Teamsters Union. On that day, according to information which has just reached me, the abduction of former Teamster President James R. Hoffa was accomplished on behalf of the Rockefellers. The reason? Frank Fitzsimmons, the current Teamster President, is being drawn into the web of Rockefeller control. Hoffa, embarking on a concerted drive to regain control of the Teamsters, constituted a distinct threat to Rockefeller progress in this area, and the Rockefellers seek every bit of control that they can possibly achieve over the distribution systems of our nation as a critical tool in producing massive supply disruptions and shortages in the near future. These in turn are to form part of the economic breakdown by which they plan to make us accept their dictatorial new Constitution. The stakes are very high, and Jimmy Hoffa got in the way, possibly without ever realizing it. I turn now to topic number 3. In October 1974, I recorded my first audio book entitled How to Protect Yourself During the Coming Depression and Third World War. In that tape, I reported that World War III was being planned to begin in a few short years, that it would be nuclear war with America as the main battleground, and that it would drag for over a year. Then in March 1975, in my audio book on the Fort Knox gold scandal and what it means to you, I reported that the war plans were still on track and explained their purpose to you more fully. But as I mentioned in that second tape, the Rockefellers were beginning to be thrown off balance by their difficulties in keeping the lid on the Fort Knox gold scandal, which, if it ever breaks into the open, could blow them out of the water insofar as their dictatorship plans are concerned. And as I say these words, these and other problems have so far prevented Nelson Rockefeller from making good his plan to expel Gerald Ford from the presidency and confer that office upon himself. There are ominous signs lately that he is now gearing up to do this as soon as the time is right. It hasn't happened yet. Yes, Nelson Rockefeller has probably made me look foolish in the eyes of some people because he failed to become president on his schedule of June 1975. I began publicly spotlighting Rockefeller's plan to do this over a year ago, before Gerald Ford became president and before he surprised everybody by selecting Rockefeller from an initial field of 15 to nominate him as Vice President. But, my friends, my very purpose in revealing the confidential information I receive about these things is to prevent them from happening if I can. I'm not one of those who, by psychic or other means, go around predicting doom and gloom and then gleefully say, "See, I told you so," if it comes true. The things I'm trying to warn you about are terrible things, not just for you, but for me too. I don't want them to happen. This is a beautiful, wonderful land that God has given to us to live in, and I want my 3 small children, as well as yours, to have the blessings of freedom with which to enjoy it when they grow up. In this spirit, I'm glad to be able to tell you of changes in the Rockefeller plans whenever these reflect failures or slippages in their diabolical scheming. And I can report to you that alterations in the war plans are now in the works, not because of anything I have done, but because of what Indira Gandhi of India has done. You probably have heard some short-lived news reports in connection with recent events in India, suggesting that the CIA might have been involved in some way. These suggestions were quickly brushed aside and hushed up by our own government, but they happen to be true. If you share the image that most Americans have of India, you probably think of teeming, overpopulated cities filled with underfed people, sacred cows wandering through the streets, vast bureaucrats' problems, and much else, and not much else at that. But India is much more than that, possessing a very considerable industrial base and relatively unexploited natural resources, such as always attract the greedy attention of the Rockefellers. For 5 years now the CIA has been working its way into position to stage a takeover of India, just as has been done elsewhere repeatedly. Just as Portugal was thrown into revolution over a year ago under a 10-year Rockefeller Plan, and just as the Union of South Africa is scheduled for extinction by the Rockefellers 3 years from now, India was under attack. And Indira Gandhi, the only really strong leader in India today, was being systematically undermined by an Indian-style Watergate staged through there as here by the CIA in behalf of the Rockefellers. But Indira Gandhi confounded everybody. She confounded everyone with her ferocious counterattack. It's tragic that, at this point at least, she has gone so far with this counterattack that she appears to have destroyed the very foundations of freedom she intended to defend. But what triggered the recent events in India was the meddling of the CIA in her internal affairs. As a result, the war plans I have warned you about up to now are being put on a back burner. They could come to the fore again, but India is such a huge prize that the war plans are now being revised on India's account. The new plan that is rapidly emerging now calls for war to begin in March 1977 with Red China and Japan attacking India. The alliance under which this would occur is already forming now. While our eyes were focused recently on the Helsinki Summit Conference to ratify Soviet conquests in Europe, the real action was going on in Asia. The Sino-Japanese Treaty of Peace and Friendship is now being negotiated as the first step toward a military alliance. As things are progressing now, these two will attack India in 1977, and Russia will come to the so-called aid of India. The United States will then be sucked into the fray, serving as a factory to supply Russia and India, and the purpose of all would be to take over India in a different way. All of this reflects a rapid and major change away from the trend that existed prior to the recent events in India. This war is planned sooner than the original schedule for World War III, since the new plans no longer call for Russia to join the new Far East Axis, but instead to be on the other side. And of course, the new plans do not involve hostilities on American soil as they stand right now. Keep in mind, though, that further changes can and probably will occur. In particular, should Indira Gandhi be toppled from power again soon, it may well enable the CIA to put the original takeover plans back on track, and that would probably restore the original plan for war on the United States by way of an attack on the Panama Canal by atomic missiles fired from Guyana. The Helsinki Summit Conference now freed Soviet Russia to turn her attention to the east, that is, to China, and try to encircle China. Let's all pray that the ugly plans for conquest by the Rockefeller brothers will yet be stopped, and let's all do our part as citizens to cause these plans to be stopped. Let's bring them to justice for stealing our gold, and from there let's start restoring sanity, integrity, and true representation in our government. The Constitution, my friends, protects all of us, and we should vote out all those people who are now in the control of the Rockefellers. We should break up their large socialist corporations and reestablish free enterprise. We should eliminate the large corporate and subsidized farms and return the land they own to individuals for small farms. And we should eliminate the personal income tax with its resultant enslavement of the middle class and the poor, while the Rockefellers go relatively free of tax by their use of tax free foundations and devices. Thank you. Until next month, this is Dr. Beter. God bless each and every one of you.